after the Norns had set themselves up there under the high one tree, but before they had threaded anything on their looms, they began. There high in the arc of heaven, Odin would wake up each morning screaming with a nightmare he could only remember almost nothing of, only that he would scream, "Something remains, something remains." And Odin did what he always did in those days, when he was filled with fear. He went to his old friend Ymir, and Ymir looked at Odin long, and then said, "When you threw away Ymir, those parts, the brain, the liver and the heart, was there anything else you think you ought to have thrown down into the pit of the world, lost from the gods?" And Odin took a step back, and he couldn't quite remember. And yet it felt the truth. There must be something somewhere in the world, something of the memory of that one giant, Ymir, who had once been all there was, in whose being lay the end of all things. For the ark of creation, the very backbone that held all together, the one tree, was made from Ymir by the gods. And Odin, who had learned to love his creation, rubbed his beard and said, "Well, maybe. But how could I find it if it was in the world?" And Ymir said, "Simple. You must follow your thread of nightmare wherever they lead you." And Odin shivered, but he knew the truth of what Ymir said. So taking his spear with him, and he decided to go down into the world. But Ymir came to him and said, "Do not go alone. Take a friend with you, a colleague for the road." And Odin wondered who. At first he obviously thought of his brother Thor, who had always stood by his side. But then he remembered Thor's impetuous temper, that he would run into any nightmare and just battle it. That wouldn't always do. No, he needed somebody who would just do what he said when he said it, and was just as brave as Thor. And of course he thought of Ymir, who lived with the gods at that time. Beautiful Ymir, not an idea in the world, but as brave as a tiger, and as fine a swordsman as ever there was in the kingdom of the Aesir. So the pair of them went down the newly minted Bifrost, down into Middle-earth. And each night Odin followed the thread of his nightmare onwards. Onwards it seemed to guide him through fear and terror, on to blind panic. Until they came at last, the two wanderers, to a strange land, where the sun neither rose nor set, a perpetual dark twilight, mingled only with dark electric purple storms that brewed out from somewhere, a world that the gods seemed to have forgot to make quite correctly. And Odin looked at it almost ashamed, and in his shame he knew there was something here, something he had forgotten, and he shivered. Just then Ymir pointed, and in front of them they could see a river, and that river was and Ymir led Odin, who seemed terribly reluctant, down a cliff to a waterfall and a mighty pool and a twisting tumult of stream, caught ever in the setting sun, a red light. And Odin looked down unwillingly into the stream, and he saw there was a mighty otter, and the otter was hunting a salmon. And the salmon had a glint of gold somewhere in it or around it or through it, that filled Odin's heart with that dread of nightmare, and he turned away. And he said, "It's something here I know so well. I've seen it so often before, but I can do nothing." And Hrungnir said, "Well, I can't do anything, but tell me, what would you do if you were going to do something?" And Odin said, "Well, I would take a spear and I would kill the fish." "No, I wouldn't kill the fish. I'd kill the otter. The fish has something of the gold in it, but the otter is just a predator. I would kill the otter." And Hrungnir said, "All right, I shall do that." And he took his bow and he shot at the otter. But he was no marksman. For although he was a strong man of God and a fine sword fighter, he was no good with spear or bow. And Odin despaired, for he would not throw his own spear. And he would not give it to Hrungnir, because he knew it would be lost. Just then, a man, a very beautiful, very young mortal man, stepped out from the rocks, and the two gods took a step back because they hadn't seen him there. And the figure said, "What are you doing?" And Odin said, "There's an otter there that needs to be killed. For if we don't kill it, somehow something will happen, some way the world will wind down. It must be killed, but I can't do it." And the young man looked over into the pool, and he saw the otter, and he saw that it was about to eat the salmon, about to kill and eat the salmon. He said, "Yes, if you want to save that salmon's life, that otter has to be killed now." And Odin said, "Well, how?" "Well, I could do it," said the young man. "I could take your spear and kill the otter. For I know by some charm that spear alone can kill that otter." And Odin knew the truth of it. But he said, "But none but me can wield the spear, those that have my blood inside them." And when Odin said that, he knew what he must do, and without thinking for a moment of the consequences, of what might happen, he cut his own wrist, and he lifted up the arm of the stranger, and he cut his wrist, and he laid the blood together. "I bind you now to me. You will be at my side, in my counsels forever. And this I swear upon the Ark of Creation. And if ever I banish you, may the Ark of Creation itself be doomed." So Odin swore, with the heavy weight of the terror of the nightmare hard upon his soul, a binding oath. In fear he swore it. And then he turned to the young man and said, "What's your name, by the way?" And the young man looked at him with new-felt power and said, "I am Loki." And Odin gave him the spear, and in one blow, Loki threw the spear down and caught the otter. Killing it, he pulled it back up using the spear's powers and laid the otter dead upon the ground. And then the gods, who were hungry, opened up the otter and they ate its flesh. And Loki made the otter's skin into a bag. And the gods laughed. And Loki laughed with the gods, for now he was one of them. But just as they were laughing, a great storm, like it was an electric storm, but not wielded by Thor, for the electricity here came from the ground and went up to the earth, brewed up, and with it a sound like volcanoes. And the gods found themselves fleeing back up the slope, fleeing away from the twist and the tumult, from the rain mingled with stones. At last they saw before them a mighty window, and below it a door, and they ran into the door. And suddenly behind them there was a sound that filled them, gods as they were, with something akin to terror. A door slammed, and they were in a dark vault. So dark they could not see each other. How long they were there they weren't quite sure. But in the end, high above them, a purple light for a moment burned bright, and then there was a sound like wings. Eagle's wings, perhaps. And Odin felt his spear and sword were being taken away from him before he knew what had happened. And the wings went back to the ledge. And then, at the edge of the ledge, there appeared a figure, greater than a man, perhaps a giant, certainly a sorcerer. And the figure looked down to them and said, "You have killed my son." "What?" said Odin. "The bag you carry, that is his skin. I sent him to the pool, down at the bottom, for there is a great treasure in there that I want. And I was prepared to risk his life to get. And now you have slain him. And I demand Weirgeld." "What do you demand?" said Odin. "I want what I wanted from him, the gold. All the gold that lies somewhere in that pool or through that pool, guarded by the salmon." And Odin said, "Normally I would go out and get it for you, but I fear I cannot move in this darkness." But Loki said, "Well, I could go. If I take the bag and fill it to the brim, will you let us go free?" And the voice said, "I would." And Loki found himself outside the cave, down at the bottom by the pool. And he knew, for he heard it in his head, that he had but an hour left to get the gold, to save his and the other god's life. And he looked at the bloody scar that Odin had cut upon his wrist, and he rubbed it. And as he rubbed it, he felt a power pulse through him. And he pulled out a hair and he plaited it, and he pulled it longer and longer and longer, and it became a line. And then he rubbed the top of his head, and horns like antlers grew out of them. And he took one of the antlers and broke it off. And he tied the thread to the antler. And then he rubbed his left hand over the scar that had been made on his right arm. And all his nails grew long as talons. And then he snipped off a talon and turned it into a hook. Just at that moment, on the cut, a fly came, and Loki crushed it, and he blew into it, and it became like a scintillating jewel. And he had bait, line, hook, and rod. And he threw them into the pool with a charm. And in a matter of no time, he felt the rod snag. And he pulled up the mighty salmon. And he caught it in his arms. And the salmon struggled and gasped for air. But Loki ignored it and said, "You will die unless you change your form, you know." And just as it was beginning to choke, the salmon changed and became a serpent. And it wriggled and struggled against Loki and tried to bite him. But Loki, holding it with the right hand, in which coursed the blood of Odin, held it fast. And he felt the blood burn through him, and with it the power. And he smiled and laughed and said, "Change again!" And the serpent was gone, and in its place there was a fast bird, a songbird, for the creature meant to escape. But Loki was expecting this move, and he caught it then, left hand against right, and blew hot at it. And when the figure felt the hot breath of Loki course through it, he knew it was trapped. And a voice, deep and old and full of hate, said, "You may see me as I am." And Loki opened his hands as if he was moulding a form. And the figure changed to its true form. There was a dwarf. And he looked at him with that old loathing that the seven fathers of dwarves save for everything that is not themselves. And Loki said, my little fellow, what treasure do you have to show me?" And the dwarf said, "Nothing." And then Loki caught him up in his hand and started to choke the dwarf. And the dwarf, caught in the right hand of a god, could not move, but rather coughed and said, I could give you all my gold, but I warn you, there is something cursed within it, For amongst that gold lies a greater treasure yet. And Loki asked, what? There is the ring that was once the voice box of Ymir, the forefather of us all. It fell upon the earth and became a red gold ring. And now it lies in my hall, and so I am cursed. And Loki said, take me to your treasure. And putting the dwarf on the ground, but holding him by the hair, he followed the dwarf, and the dwarf seemed to be able to go behind the waterfall. And there was a great cavern, but it was bare, save for a mighty treasure. Then Loki took down the bag, and he filled up the great treasury. And he turned to the dwarf and said, is that it? And the dwarf said, yes, that is it. But Loki had noticed that the dwarf was wearing a single gold band made of red gold that glowed like old rekindled hate upon his index finger. And before the dwarf could move, Loki reached out the right hand and he grabbed the index finger of the dwarf and he broke it off and said, not quite all. Now this treasure is mine. And as he held up the ring, he felt its power course into him and through him. He felt for that moment the apex of the very arc stone of creation. An arc stone and a creation that would live or die by his fate. And he put the ring in his pocket. And then he turned, but the dwarf was already leaving, vanishing into the shadows as one newly freed, and with almost a happy sigh. And then Loki turned, climbed out of the cave and back up, and the door in the hillside opened for him, and he was soon before the sorcerer. And he held up the mighty bag, the otter's bag, filled with treasure. And the sorcerer smiled and said, you have done well. And a great hand reached down and pulled up the treasure. But as it pulled up, the gold clanked. And the sorcerer said, that is no good. It should make no noise. I said fill the bag entirely. I see there, said the sorcerer, looking down at Loki, you have a glint of gold in your pocket. And before anyone could stop him, Ymir had reached into the pocket of Loki. Now he was too foolish to truckle with rings, and he said, oh yes, you forgot this bit, Loki, but you've done very well apart from that. And he gave it then to the sorcerer, and the sorcerer stuffed the ring, the golden ring, into the head of the otter. And Odin said, if you've got my weapons at least. And the sorcerer handed back the spear and the sword, and suddenly, with a loud snap, the gods found themselves outside the chasm. And Odin stood shaking and quivering. The ring is lost. What shall I do? But there was a sound like an earthquake, and a twisted tumult was coming up from the very earth itself. And Odin said, what is it? And Loki said, well, I found a little hole. I noticed this before. I think it must have been the keyhole. And he looked in and he said, the bag, it's changing, it's shifting, it's becoming a dragon. A dragon, the mighty dragon Fafnir, it calls itself. And the sorcerer, his father, is battling it. The dragon has caught it and burned the sorcerer bright, there deep into the earth. Going down into the dark, and we cannot follow it. And Odin, his heart filled with something akin to mortal terror, led the other two back to heaven, knowing the task was not yet complete, if complete it ever could be. And he went and saw Ymir, and the pair of them walked up. They walked up to the one tree. And Odin told him all that had happened, and Ymir said, well, the story is not yet done, and may not be done, until the end of all things. And just at that moment they heard two sounds. The first was the sound of a thread upon a loom, for the Norns had started their design. And the second was a loud laughter ringing out from far Valhalla Hall. For Loki, for the first time, was laughing in Valhalla. Now it turned out, as the world wore on, that in distant days Odin had two heroes, Sigmund and Siegfried, father and son, come and fight the dragon Fafnir, who lay at the root upon the Rhine, the root above the Rhine. And that battle was long and grievous, and Sigmund was killed, and his son Siegfried barely revenged his father, and was slain. And as Siegfried was slain, Loki brought Odin to the chasm again. And Odin, seeing Siegfried, mourned, but he had mourned and moved his body aside because he wanted to get the dragon skin that held the ring. But as he touched Siegfried's body, some of Siegfried's blood came upon Odin and seemed to almost blind him. He snatched then the dragon skin that had turned back into gold and otter skin, and emptying the gold upon the earth with a curse, but keeping the ring in the head, he flew back to heaven, leaving Loki with the gold and a rueful smile. But there was a blindness on the god on that day, and he held the bag the wrong way up. And so it was that even as Odin flew to heaven, thinking at last he had caught the last part of the Ymir, the red gold ring fell upon the wall and fell to the south and the lands of Surt. And so, although Loki knows it, and Odin would deny it if he could, but knows it in his heart, the red gold ring of his father, Ymir, came to Surt, and with it the power in the end to destroy even heaven's ark.